A lot of people who were once fans of the Walking Dead TV show gave up along the way. Now, at the height of its popularity in season 5, it averaged about 14 million views per episode. But by the end of the series, in season 11, it was averaging just 1.7 million views. That is an 88% drop in viewership. But why did people give up on the show? People might attribute it to a single moment, but when a show like The Walking Dead is the most popular show on TV, and fans are die-hard supporters of it, it takes more than one bad moment to lose them. So let's investigate why The Walking Dead fell off. Now, a common thing that we hear about The Walking Dead's downfall is that the show simply went on for too long. And the viewing figures reflect this, right? With viewership declining from its high in season 5, dropping a couple million each season until an all-time low at the end of the show in season 11. That gradual decline certainly suggests viewers just slowly lost interest over time, with only a few die-hard fans, like me, sticking around until the very end. Sounded like I was bragging, but I'm not sure that's a flex. And look, it's a hard thing to do, to get a viewer to give up on characters and a story that they've already put hours and hours of their time and attention into. But by the time The Walking Dead finished, there were multiple spin-offs already airing. Fear the Walking Dead, World Beyond, and the main series had lost so much of its cast, including Andrew Lincoln, who played Rick, the main guy. And frankly, the storylines were just getting repetitive. Like the main group come across another group whose leader ends up being a bad guy, and we enter into a conflict where we see that people are the real enemies in this world, not just the zombies. We saw it with the Governor and Woodbury, we saw it with Terminus, we saw it with the Saviors and Negan, and we saw it with the Commonwealth. I actually think the Whisperers were one of the more interesting groups of antagonists, but so much of the audience had given up by that point that most fans won't even have seen the slightly different angle that they brought. And honestly, the going on too long criticism doesn't just feel like it was about the show, but certain storylines. The Saviors arc, for example, which, before it happened, was one of the most anticipated storylines from the comics that fans wanted to see on TV. But then, fans felt like dragging it out for 3 seasons was kind of overkill and killed the pacing, which is evidenced by almost 50% of the audience who were watching during the start of the Saviors arc not making it to the end of the Saviors arc. Now, the season with the biggest drop-off in viewership was season 7, with 17 million people tuning into the season premiere and only 11 million people sticking around till the finale. That's 35% of viewers dropping off, giving up on the show. And they didn't really drop off across the season. Most of them stopped after the opener, with 17 million people watching episode 1 and only 12 million coming back for episode 2. And if you're familiar with the show, you know exactly what that season premiere was and exactly what happened. The season 6 finale ended with Negan beating one of the main characters with his trusted baseball bat. But it was shot in a way that infuriated fans. It shot POV, from the perspective of the victim, meaning we didn't know who died. And fans kind of likened it to clickbait, cheaply forcing us to wait until season 7 to find out the resolution of what had happened and who had been killed. The issue was multi-layered though, because the very storyline in the comics famously had Glenn as the victim of Negan's brutality. But the show had twice already betrayed viewers' trust with a bait and switch on Glenn's death. Twice already viewers thought Glenn had died and then, by some miracle, he had survived. So it's safe to say that viewers were losing faith in the way the show was handling their attention and trust. So season 7 opened with the reveal that it was actually Abraham who was killed, not Glenn like in the comics, only for the episode to later reveal that Glenn was killed in retaliation for Daryl not staying in line like Negan asked, which kind of felt like another bait and switch. And viewers seem to have 2 reactions to these circumstances. The first was that Glenn was one of the few remaining characters that they cared about, that they wanted to have a happy ending. What with the show having had a big turnover of characters over the past few seasons since they left the prison, and Glenn being one of the few who had been in it from the start. But also because the writers seemed to be taking their attention for granted. The Walking Dead had almost become clickbaity with twists and cliffhangers, and not in a way that offered a rewarding payoff. If you have good characters and you tell good stories, viewers will come back. You don't need these gimmicks. And for a lot of fans, these gimmicks is what made them give up on the show. So speaking of clickbait, the middle of season 4 of The Walking Dead changed up the show's formula a little bit. And based on the numbers, that change didn't really do the show any good. You see, seasons 1, 2, and 3 all saw viewership increase consistently. The show tripled in popularity between the season 1 premiere and the season 4 premiere. However, at the end of the arc with the governor and the prison, The Walking Dead kinda changed up the way it told its stories. Our group had to split up after their final showdown with the governor, including him firing a tank at their prison. And so we had half a season where our characters were all separated. Daryl and Beth were together, Tyrese, Carol and 2 kids were together, we had Carl, Michonne and Rick going off as a group, and Glenn was separated from Maggie. And so the show opted to tell these stories in a way that meant certain episodes were dedicated to 1 or 2 of these groups. And theoretically that makes sense, right? We get some great character-focused episodes which builds our emotional connection to certain characters. And it gives us some breathing space after the all-out war with the governor. That's in theory, but in practice, this format meant that viewers would often have to wait 2, sometimes 3 episodes, which meant 2 or 3 weeks, before seeing their favourite characters again, which again was made worse by the clickbait natures of cliffhangers that we would be left on at the end of each episode, which wouldn't be resolved for 3, maybe 4 episodes. The show seemed to be leaning into these cheap tricks to retain its audience, rather than focusing on what had made it the biggest show on TV so far, which was telling good, interesting stories with characters we cared about. And this divided stories and slowing of the pace continued for the rest of the show. The Saviors arc would have episodes focusing on Alexandria, then another one focusing on the Sanctuary, then Hilltop, then the Kingdom, then Oceanside. Again, with cliffhangers in certain locations being dangled for weeks before they were ever resolved. Another death, besides just Glenn's, that's often attributed with the death of the show is the death of Carl Grimes. Now for years we followed Rick, our main character, through many arcs. His dictator arc, his biting a man's throat out arc, his peaceful arc, his arc where he loses his mind, and his wreck of a man arc where Negan leaves him feeling powerless and unable to protect his people. Through Rick's entire journey, the different stages of his character, there was one common thread. Everything he was doing, every decision he was making, and by extension, everything the group was going through, was to create a better world for Carl to live in. So when the showrunners killed off Carl, viewers were left feeling frustrated. Almost like the entire plot of the show had just been lost at this point. And when you couple that with some rumours that Chandler Riggs, who played Carl, was treated less than fairly when he was being written out of the show, it was kind of a straw that broke the camel's back for many fans. And the last nail in the coffin for The Walking Dead was the main character, Rick, being written out. So after Andrew Lincoln decided he wanted to leave the show, they had no choice but to write Rick out. However, they didn't want to kill him since they still had plans to eventually bring his character back. Originally for some Walking Dead films, which eventually turned into the Rick and Michonne spin-off show, The One Who Lived. Ones who lived, there are 2 of them, that's plural. Either way, Rick leaving the show so soon after Carl had been killed, and on top of all the other issues with the writing and the pacing and the repetitive story arcs, the show's viewers dwindled to the lowest point in the show's history, even less than in the very first season. And a show that had once dominated network TV fizzled out a couple of years later. But just because the show fizzled out, AMC didn't give up on it. They didn't give up on the Walking Dead universe, and they greenlit a bunch of spin-offs after the main show's conclusion. Dead City with Maggie and Negan exploring New York, Daryl Dixon with Daryl venturing to Europe and exploring the wider universe of The Walking Dead, and The Ones Who Live, which completed Rick and Michonne's story some 6 years after Rick left the show. But did the somewhat fresh starts recapture fans' love of the show and return The Walking Dead to its heyday of viewership numbers? No. Not really. Daryl Dixon premiered to just 600,000 viewers in the US, Dead City to 700,000 viewers, and The Ones Who Live to just under 900,000 viewers. No episode from any of the spin-offs reached 1 million US viewers, which would put it below every single episode of The Walking Dead in terms of viewership. Now sure, the business model of watching the show on TV when The Walking Dead first came out to all of these shows coming out in the era of streaming might skew the data somewhat, but there's no way it skewed the data enough to suggest that these shows actually recaptured the heyday of The Walking Dead. So maybe The Walking Dead ship has sailed. And if you like listening to me talk about TV shows, in this video I discuss Lost and myth bust a bunch of common things you've probably heard people say about the show, like they never explained the polar bear or they were dead the whole time, both of which are false.